Good evening to everyone here. I am so excited to see so many of you here to listen and to learn and to share your perspective with us today. My name's Sharon Myron. I am a Multnomah County Commissioner representing District 1, and that is all of the West Side, including the CEI Hub, which we're going to talk a lot about tonight, and also the inner East Side out to Cesar Chavez and up to I-84. And I remember, it was almost 2 years ago, pre-COVID, a whole other era, but being in Linton and in St. John's with many of you. And I've seen so many familiar faces and so many familiar names on the screen and signing up for this event. And I am so energized to be back together at this milestone in our shared work to address the risks surrounding the CEI Hub. So as most of us likely know, the hub represents a huge environmental and emergency management risk in our region specifically, but with consequences for the entire state and frankly, the entire country. Yes. The report that we will be discussing this evening details the scope and extent of damage that is likely to occur in the event of a major earthquake in our region due to the CEI hub. The predicted impacts are truly horrific. This kind of analysis helps move us toward answering that big question, which is really, so what are we going to do about it? How can we hold industry accountable for being part of these solutions to prevent catastrophe, and to the extent catastrophe occurs, hold them accountable for the damage that is caused? Really, these have been my driving questions since learning about the CEI Hub, and that catalyzed our joint investment in the study across jurisdictions. Our community, through advocacy, organizing, harnessing expertise, and so much more, has fueled this work. Forgive the pun using fueled, I can't help myself, but I am so looking forward to hearing from you tonight to continue to inform this work as it moves forward. Tonight, you will be hearing from the project team from the City of Portland's Bureau of Emergency Management and Multnomah County's Office of Sustainability, these are all mouthfuls, as well as Eco Northwest, and then we'll have ample time for questions and comments. I'm looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts and your feedback and your ideas and considerations as we really dive into this. So thanks for being here. And I want to give a couple of special shout outs. There are some fellow elected officials that I saw in our participant list. And these include, first of all, our fellow county commissioner, Commissioner Stegman from District 4. Also Oregon State Senator Michael Dembrow, Oregon State Representative Maxine Dexter, staff from Senator Ron Wyden's office, staff from Mayor Ted Wheeler's office, staff from our fellow commissioner Jessica Vega Peterson's office, and there may be others that I apologize if I'm missing you, but who are present. I also want to do a big shout out to City Commissioner Joanne Hardesty. She can't be here today. She's out of town for some well-deserved rest. But she has been an unwavering partner in pushing this work forward. So thanks again to everyone for your participation. And with that, I am going to hand this off to my other board colleague here this evening, who has been my other true compatriot and partner, Commissioner Sushila Jayapal.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Myron. Good evening, everybody. It is great to see such a crowded Zoom room. Thank you all so much for being here. I want to start by thanking Commissioner Myron for her leadership and her dedication to this work. She has really spearheaded it, and it has been a privilege to partner with her in it. My name is Sushila Jayapal. I am your County Commissioner for District 2, which is North and Northeast Portland, parts of East Portland. It's everything north of I-84, south of the river, starts in the St. John's neighborhood to the northwest corner, goes all the way out to Northeast 186th. So it includes the neighborhoods directly across the river from the CEI hub, including Cathedral Park, St. John's, and others. My district also includes some of the most diverse neighborhoods in the city, the highest percentages of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. These are folks who already experience disproportionate impacts from industrial pollution and who we know will be the most impacted by any disaster or catastrophic event. So those are some of the specific reasons that I've joined Commissioner Myron in supporting this study. And in addition, of course, to my concern about the region-wide, statewide impacts of a disaster. So I'm really pleased that we've reached this milestone in the project, which, as Commissioner Myron said, started 2 years ago with community meetings that we hosted in Linton and St. John's. The overall message of the report is clear and is not in the least surprising. When the earthquake happens, not if, but when, the likely consequences to and from the CEI hub will be catastrophic. It'll be catastrophic to commercial activity, to recreation, to culture, and most of all to the air we breathe, our water, and our very lives. But the work to really detail all of those consequences is vital to the next steps, which are to quantify the financial risk and to figure out how to place that risk where it belongs, with the industry that created and is profiting from it. If we've learned anything from these last 18 months, it is that a future that was once unimaginable is here. It's not just beginning, it's not on its way, it's not going to be here at some point, it's here. A once in a generation virus, wildfires that behave like none we've ever seen, an unprecedented heat dome, drought, it's all here. And this report is part of the effort to meet that future. And we need your participation and input, which is the purpose of this evening's meeting. So thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to hearing from our experts and most of all, to hearing from you. And with that, I think I'm turning it over to John.
Thank you, commissioners. My name is John Vashitinsky. I'm the Director of Sustainability here at Multnomah County. I'm part of the project team with Jonah and our consultants at Eco Northwest. Thank you everyone for coming. I also want to just give a quick shout out to my boss, Chair Kafori, and her ongoing support for this project. We are really at an intermediate step in the project, meaning that we deliberately built into our plan this meeting and meetings with tribal governments and with other local governments to make sure that we're not missing anything. That's our hope tonight, is that as you listen to the report from our friends at Eco Northwest, that you can help bring your local knowledge to bear to make sure that our final report is as accurate and complete as possible. And of course, when that report is done, we'll come back around and talk to everyone again and share those results with you. But I really do want to emphasize that we're trying to be open, transparent, and get as much information as possible from you all throughout the process. I'm just going to pass off to my compatriot here, Jana Papafamiu.
Thank you, John Washitinsky. It's a treat to be here representing the City of Portland. My name is Jonah Pope, and I'm the Interim Director at the City of Portland's Bureau of Emergency Management. I also must express a gratitude to my boss, Mayor Ted Wheeler, and his staff. Many of them are also on the call tonight and, like myself, are really interested in taking tonight to listen to the community and hear their feedback on the work that we've done so far. This is a project that I think represents in so many ways the kind of policy making work that we want to be doing at the city and in partnership with the county, where we are splitting the work 50-50, we are splitting the cost 50-50, we are looking to make decisions based on evidence and data, and so we're making an investment up front to really understand well the risks. And maybe just to build on what John said, maybe just a reminder where we're at in this process, that we've collected up all the public information that we can find about the CEI hub. And tonight we're going to sort of tell a story, albeit a sort of engineering-y story, about what we think would happen in that place after an earthquake. And we're telling it now when we're only part way through, because we want to check that story against local knowledge and understand how the experiences of community and people who are in the place every day can help us tell a truer, more accurate, better story. And then when that information is incorporated, we will go on to the economic part of the study and assign a dollar amount to the losses that is a bit gross in a way. Sorry, with respect to Dr. Domanski. We know that there are losses in the CI hub, spiritual losses for tribes, lost lives and family homes, potentially things that can't be compensated. But that coming to that number and also understanding the legal responsibilities for that dollar amount, I hope will be helpful to us in imagining a policy path forward that can garner broad support. I think we've often heard that that retrofits are very expensive, and that is true. But I think part of what we will learn is that doing nothing is also very expensive, and so I think will help us better weigh the costs and benefits of addressing the risks that we see there. So I'm super excited to be a part of the team with folks from the county, and I think I get to turn it over to Adam and Laura.
Well, no, I think
Sorry.
Renee's going to just give us a few
apologies.
ground rules.
Yes,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jonah. Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. My name is Renee Zinga. I use she, her pronouns, and I work in Commissioner Myron's office. Just a couple of notes about how we're hoping to run tonight. As you can see, this is a really big meeting. We've got over 100 folks on the call, which is really exciting. It also means that there's a lot to juggle on a virtual platform. So I want to just thank everyone in advance for your patience and grace with any technical difficulties or general clunkiness as we navigate a big public meeting in this virtual format. So a couple of things that should help things move smoothly tonight. This meeting is being recorded and the recording will be available tomorrow on the Multnomah County website. We'll ask everyone to remain muted in order to manage background noise and interruptions during the meeting and the presentation. But as we move into questions and comments later in the meeting, we will ask folks to unmute as needed to participate. Our plan, in order to allow presenters from Eco Northwest to get through their presentation, we will hold questions until the conclusion of that presentation. And at that time, in order to ask a question or make a comment, and I see that folks are already very active in the chat, which is great. Participants will have two options. One, you can write your question in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat and collecting questions to address at the end of the presentation. If you haven't yet been exploring, you can open the chat function on the bottom panel of your screen. You can click chat and a window should appear along the right side of your view. Or you can use the raise hand function to enter the queue if you would prefer to ask a question or make a comment verbally. In order to hear from everyone, we want to make sure that we hear from everyone tonight. We would ask that you limit your questions to a couple of minutes to make sure that we get to everyone. That raise hand function is in a similar place to the chat button. It can be found along the bottom of your screen under the reactions button with the smiley face. You click on that link and then you can raise your hand. Similarly, we'll keep track of folks who raise a hand and we'll work through that queue at the conclusion of the presentation. Also, just a note that for everyone, the comment form on our website is another way to provide additional thoughts or feedback, and we'll include that link. I think John actually did include that link to the form in the chat on the Multnomah County Sustainability website. So now I will hand it over to our presenters.
Perfect. And first things first, we've got to get the screen sharing up. So let me do that and just confirm that it works for everyone. Okay, are you all seeing my screen? Renee, I'll maybe ask you directly.
Yes, looks great.
And is it the note slide or the main slide?
It is the intro slide.
Perfect. Okay, Adam, I'll pass it off to you then.
Great, thanks, Laura. And thank you everybody for joining this evening and giving up some of your evening to participate in this meeting. It's understandably not a fun topic or a fun task, but an important one nevertheless. Just by way of introduction, my name is Adam Domanski. I'm a PhD economist with Eco Northwest. I've been with Eco Northwest for about almost 4 years now, and I work nearly exclusively on environmental natural resource issues. Before coming to Eco Northwest, I was with NOAA just outside of Washington, D.C., and there I worked exclusively on oil spills and hazardous waste sites, including spending a sizable portion of my career working on the Deepwater Horizon spill. So I must say that I greatly applaud the county and the city and the region for looking at the impacts of a spill before it happens, and it's just such a better place to be. So let's go ahead and we'll dive right in. By way of a little bit of background, so when we talk about the CEI hub, just so we all know we're on the same page, a lot of you may be familiar with the area and what it is. It's a group of fuel storage and transfer facilities. They're privately operated and they're run by a number of different companies, and they're actually a little geographically dispersed, but largely along the west bank of the Willamette River in downtown Portland. It's an important facility because over 90% of the liquid fuel supply in Oregon comes through the CEI hub. And as the region knows, there's this potential Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, as well as some potential other earthquakes that could cause dramatic harm to structures and buildings in the region, and structures and buildings that contain oil are going to be even more problematic. So that's what this study is focusing on. As has been mentioned a couple times, it really is an interim step. So today we're really talking about those physical impacts. So going through what we know and what we've learned about what's in the tanks, how at risk of failure they are given an earthquake, and then when that oil goes out, evaporates or burns, where are those materials going to go? So it's very much the physical impacts. Resulting portions of our work are going to evaluate damages. And when I talk about damages, I mean the monetary costs. And so these are going to be costs to clean up, as well as costs that communities or individuals have to bear. So health effects, environmental effects, and a full gauntlet of things. And then the third portion, the final portion of this work, is to identify the financial responsibility. So go through and work through, who's expected or will bear the cleanup cost, what portions of other costs may or may not be accounted for. And then at that point, this report is really going to serve as the basis to determine, well, how can policy be changed to account for those costs and hopefully internalize them into upfront decision-making with the goal of preventing the accident in the first place. I also want to just give a quick shout out to my project team. Laura and I are from Echo Northwest. Laura's been the project manager on this, and also want to give great credit to our great partners with Hart Krauser, Allison Perch, and Della Graham. They've really done a heavy lift at this front end of evaluating the specific contents and seismic resilience of the structures at the hub. So with all of our work, we always really want to narrow down and identify what is the research question? What are we trying to answer here? And specifically for this presentation and this portion of the work, we want to know is what's in the tanks, what is expected to be in the tanks on a given day or time when this earthquake occurs, and then what's happened. Is the fuel going to stay in the tanks? Are the tanks going to release? And once these materials go somewhere, where are they going to go? What are they going to touch? And then what are those resulting impacts? The policy scenario we're modeling here is a 9.0 magnitude Cascadia earthquake on the Cascadia subduction zone fault, which is a bit offshore, but is expected to cause substantial damage in the area. In some of her previous presentations, Allison's really explained this well. There's also the Portland Hills fault and other earthquakes that may occur. But given that this is expected to likely occur, hopefully in the distant future, but at some point in time, that this is really the policy scenario to be doing these evaluations on. One of the first challenges that we have run into and that we've really grappled with is there is so much uncertainty, and all of that uncertainty is cumulative and it builds on each other. So we've got an earthquake, the ground's going to shake, the soil's going to move, the buildings are going to rock. At that point, we needed to make a determination on what's going to be the physical damage to these tanks and any containment structures at the sites, how much fuel is going to be in there at the time of the incident, what's the fate and transfer of those fuels, how much of it's going to go in the river and where's it going to go, is it going to catch fire? And all of this is subject to seasonal variation. There's seasonal variation of fuel in the tanks. There's seasonal variation in the river flow and winds. And in terms of susceptible critters and resources downstream, some are migratory species, some are anadromous fish that show up at different times of year. And so there's kind of a high and a low and an in-between for every one of these things, and they all build on each other. And one thing we could do is let's take the worst of the worst of the worst, and then the minimum of the minimum minimum. And what we'll have is just a really broad range of outcomes. And that's not going to be entirely helpful from a policy perspective. So what we've really tried to focus on is understanding that range of uncertainty and identifying that range of likely impacts that's going to be meaningful for policy. But also keep in mind that just by the nature of these uncertainties building on each other, that things could be much worse or not as bad. But I do feel strongly that the results of what we're presenting are at least the range of likely impacts that we can identify at this time. And with that, let me pass it over to Laura to get into some of the fun nitty-gritty of what we found so far.
Thanks, Adam. So the next couple slides, I'm going to be talking through the estimated extent and magnitude of the releases. So what's there, how much of it is there, what is it made of, and how likely is it to release the fuels in the event of a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake? So the way we approached this was using 4 what I'm going to call failure variables. And so each of these we'll discuss in turn in the next couple slides. The first of which is geologic risk. So this is how susceptible is the land, the soil stability effectively, how susceptible is the land to things like liquefaction and lateral spread. Next, tank location. So there are properties at different areas. Some tanks are right next to the water, some are further upland, and that informs in a part where the material will go if it's released. Next, tank integrity. And so this is the seismic resiliency of the tank itself, which will definitely be a determining factor in the tank failure. And lastly, tank contents. So again, is it hazardous? Is it flammable? What's there? Is it volatile? And that again informs fire risk and how nasty it'll be if this stuff is released into the air, water, ground. So before we go too much further, we haven't shown you all a map yet. So we wanted to be sure to do that here. You'll see the CEI hub parcels in orange. Hopefully folks can see that. And one thing I want to point out is this is a 6-mile stretch on the Willamette River upstream from Northwest Portland. And you can see here the diversity of land use types. We have Forest Park just on the other side of the highway, the St. John's area and the peninsula, and really being really close to a highly urbanized, highly residential area, which when we look at other oil spills, they don't necessarily happen in this high of population density, this high of economic activity occurring nearby areas all the time. And so that's something to consider with the damages that we'll look at in the next phase. One other thing I want to point out with this slide is we are tasked only with the impacts of CEI hub failures due to the earthquake. There's other industrial properties here that also store sometimes even fuels similar to CEI hub, but our focus here is really on the CEI hub properties given the extent of the resources that are stored there. And next, before we go into the tank data, I want to spend a moment on pipelines. So you folks may or may not be aware that there is a large Olympic pipeline that essentially comes down from northern Washington to the CEI hub effectively. And then from there, there's other pipelines that go out, such as the Kinder Morgan PDX pipeline that has the jet fuel to the airport, which is obviously a very important resource. With the pipelines, let me check my notes here. The thing I want to make sure to say is they
Laura, we may have lost you, so let me kind of pick up where I know she was at, and then when she jumps on in, she can continue. So the thing that we are really focusing on here is the CEI hub. I think one of the challenges with this study is we're not just talking about the ground shaking at the CEI hub. It's a region-wide event, and there may be additional leaks from the pipeline anywhere along the way. And then all of this is happening within the context of a pretty dramatic disaster. And so what we are really going to be focusing on is, I think, a theme throughout this, and it's just the impacts of the CEI hub. Let me pick up the presentation, so I happen to have it up as well. Okay, So yeah, just to keep in mind that this is part of a bigger function, and really the CI hub works as kind of a holding valve that it kind of fills up, oil flows out, flows in, and things really vary. The evaluation of the site, we've worked with permit data, with aerial photography and information from the fire marshal in Portland, and identified a total of 630 tanks. 558 of them have available specific data associated with them. 72 of them we've only identified from aerial photos alone. 143 of them are out of service, and there are 415 active tanks. So that's the 415 are the ones that we're going to be focusing on. We do know something about the capacity, and we do know something generally about the fuels that are held within them. And this is going to be important when we start talking about impacts as well. But we know that the cumulative kind of highest quantity being held is that lighter oil, with less going down. Now you'll notice down there, we do have an empty category. So there are tanks that are technically not out of service, but are generally empty. From information that we've looked at, it looks like on average, the tanks are filled at about 67%. And so that's what's going to generate our expected fill column on the right. So if you kind of think about how we're walking down, we identify the tanks, we know maximum capacity, and then now we know expected fill by fuel type. The next part of the evaluation was really to look at the geological risk. And so this is something that Hart-Krauser and Allison's team worked really deeply on. And it's to look at the soil conditions, what is shaking at the site going to look like, what's the liquefaction, so how is that soil going to settle underneath the tanks, and then through that they developed settlement and strength loss estimates for each location. And here what you'll see is this is an area of that map. It's twisted a little bit, but these in outline are the various facilities at the CEI hub along the Willamette River. And as you can see, they're largely in high, very high or moderate areas of liquefaction susceptibility. Additionally, on top of that, we've identified damage zones, and that's to try and determine what portion of the fuel, should it release, is going to end up on the land on site, on the land off site, or end up in the water. And for each of the properties, they identified damage zones based on distance from the water and different conditions at the site. And so for example, the Area 1 Kinder Morgan site, all the tanks that are between 0 and 500 feet from the water, if those tanks fail, we expect those contents to end up in the water. Things that are 500 to 750 feet away, we expect to potentially end up in the water, potentially end up in the land. Things farther away are in the land. And it varies by location, really, just because of the geological and geomorphic specificities of each site. Now, the next thing to keep in mind is tank age. And this is something that's pretty consistent across buildings, that over time, as buildings have been built, the standards to which they're built and seismic standards and engineering, even understanding of how things move around has improved. But largely, any tanks built before 1993 and not retrofitted are largely expected to fail, and with about 50 to 100% of their contents released. Things from 1993 to 2004 could fail, might not. We expect an average value of about 10% of those values, contents to release. And any tanks built 2004 are built to newer standards, and we expect that they are unlikely to fail, but still have up to a 10% volume release. And so then going back to, we had this kind of broken out by volume. Now this is now by number of tanks. You'll see the vast majority of tanks built at the site are old, and that's not entirely surprising, but they're going to be built before 1993 or of an unknown date. And then this is the distribution by the type of fuels that they hold. Now, when we take all of that together, we take the quantity, the expected fill, the liquefaction and ground shaking, the age of the tanks and where they're located, we expect that between 94 to 194 million gallons are going to be released. You know, big numbers sound big and they're kind of hard to conceptualize, but just to frame it, Deepwater Horizon was between 134 to 206 million gallons, but that occurred over the course of many weeks, offshore, a lot of dispersion, and remember how bad that was. Of the substances there, about 93% of them are flammable, 81% are these lighter medium oils, and 12% are heavy oils. So we can't understate the extent to which this is potentially dramatic. On top of the total release, about 40 to 82 million gallons are likely to end up in the Willamette River and travel downstream. So then, as we're walking you through the site, the tanks, the age, the fuels, and then how much is going to get out, and then what's going to happen with it. Right now, let me start talking about the physical impacts. So the type of fuel matters quite a bit in an oil spill because how it behaves and how we should respond to clean it up varies quite a bit by the type of fuel. So the lighter fuel, something that's more refined like a gasoline or jet fuel, is something that's a non-persistent light fuel, meaning it's particularly going to evaporate. These are the kind of things that they don't go out and boom, they don't do heavy cleanup activities. So the long-term comparative impacts to resources in the water compared to a heavy oil is much smaller, but that doesn't mean it disappears. That means it travels up into the air. It means it's going to create a plume of unhealthy air in the area with toxins and volatile organic chemicals. And then on top of that, the more volatile it is, the more likely it is to catch fire. And so that's obviously going to be problematic and produce other issues on its own. As we go through the different categories of oil, let me just jump to the bottom category, that the real thick, heavy oil is stuff that isn't going to volatilize, is likely to stay in the water, and is likely to move downstream and in some cases sink. I worked on a pipeline spill in the Kalamazoo River in Michigan that had this very thick tar sands oil, and it actually sank to the bottom of the river. And so the cleanup action there, it isn't just booms and skimming, it actually involves going out and dredging and doing a cleanup activity that ends up being pretty destructive to the habitat. So what we're really trying to do is map out this likelihood of spill combined with what does it mean for that oil to spill. So this is just kind of a graphic of what I was describing about the volatilization of fuel over time. And, you know, I mentioned fire, and it's on our mind, especially as we're getting later into the summer and particularly with our experiences in the last couple of years. But fire is problematic, and it's problematic on site, particularly due to the safety of individuals working and living nearby, safety of responders, and just the ability to deal with the issue. And then there's the air plume issue. Whether it catches fire is really pretty idiosyncratic, and it just depends on whether there's an ignition source. What we're expecting is you've got big metal tanks, you got power lines, you've got other things moving around, sparking, that there is a likely high probability of ignition, particularly for those more volatile fuels. And I mentioned the percent of material remaining depending on the type of fuels. So what we did is we took this and threw it into a NOAA model that actually predicts how fuels behave over time. And you would see that within half a day of the release, most of the gasoline would volatilize and disappear. About 40% of the crude and diesel would volatilize, but then it would kind of just stay at that level, and the thicker fuels would stay. And the way that matters is where is this fuel going and how far downstream is it going? You know, I mentioned at the beginning there's seasonal effects. So in the winter, there's a lot more water coming downstream. There's a quicker river flow. So that's our image on the right. If this were to occur in the winter, we would expect the plume of oil on the water to likely hit the Pacific Ocean, the mouth of the Columbia, within 3 days. In the summer, it would be 15 days. And so this really makes a difference for, well, how much fuel is still left? How much of those compounds have or have not volatilized? What's the extent of cleanup action necessary? And then what is this potentially going to mean for cleanup action and closure of the river? So let me pause real quick and see if Laura's been able to rejoin us.
I sure have. Thank you, Adam, for the quick cover. My apologies, everyone, on the Wi-Fi cutting out. I'll jump in here. Yeah. The next couple slides, we're going to talk about the impacts, which is probably the thing that a lot of you are very interested in addition to how much, what's going to happen when those fuels are released. And so one thing I want to do here is pause, and we've said it a couple of times, I know already, but remind folks where we are in the process of this project. So these are, you can think of the direct physical impacts from releases at the CEI hub. In our next phase of the project, we are looking at the cost of cleanup, the damages, from a financial perspective, the impact of not having a fuel supply because it all was just released from the CEI hub tanks. And so we are not there yet. This, again, those direct physical impacts, making sure we get feedback from folks to understand if we're thinking about the right things and characterizing it correctly. So we'll start with the physical and property impacts, the first one, and then next go into navigation and river-related commercial activities, since this portion of the Willamette River is definitely used for commercial river activities as well as recreation, which will be our next topic from there. Impacts on the environment, crucially important, I think, at least for me personally, when I think about oil spills, I see those images of the birds and the impacted wildlife. So things that we are taking very seriously and we want to characterize through this report. Air quality as well, and then cultural resources. So we'll talk about each in turn. The first, people and property. So there's, again, some uncertainty here. The fuel releases are likely to cause direct harm to the folks who are immediately in the vicinity. So injury, killed is what I mean by direct harm there. So there's about 200 people who work at the CEI hub, but this is in a heavy industrialized area. There are other nearby workers. There's people, some of whom might be on this call, who live nearby, and then people traveling through the area as well. And so direct physical harm is a component there that we're thinking through. And to understand the magnitude will somewhat depend on, again, if there's a fire or not, how far the fuels and materials go downriver, how much of it burns, and how bad the air quality is, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides. But just to give you a sense, the 2 zip codes here on the south of the Willamette River, where this is located, have a combined population of 16,500 and total employment of 31,500. So folks in the immediate area, that's the magnitude we're working with there. Next, with navigation and commercial activity. So we wanted to know, okay, if the fuels are released into the river and the river is closed as a result, what would be the impact to this sector of the economy? And so the first thing we did was, okay, how many vessels are going through this river over a period of time? So this is monthly data here that we have in the table. And you can see it varies from 430 to about 700 at the max. And I do want to specify, though, that these are vessels that have what are called AIS transponders. So they do not include the folks who are going out there fishing or smaller recreation vessels. It's just those larger vessels that are required to have these, or some that have them as well, optionally, that send those signals. And so we know how many vessels are using this. What type are they was the next question. So what's pretty obvious from this pie chart is the majority are towing vessels, which is not surprising because they're taking so many frequent trips. And vessels that originate in this area are going up to the Columbia or other regions to do the towing. We talked about recreation vessels in the last couple of slides. So that's something that we're taking really seriously as well. We had the opportunity to actually go out with a fire marshal and go on a boat on the Willamette River on a beautiful day in March. And there were quite a few people fishing. There were paddle boarders. This area is definitely popular, even though it's fairly industrialized. And you can see from this map here, there are multiple parks located on the waterfront, as well as the very important Forest Park located just on the other side of the highway. Downstream, Sauvie Island and the Multnomah Channel. So if we think about where the oil in the water might be distributed downstream, some pretty serious impacts there if beach and swimming and that kind of access is impacted. And then lastly, there's an intersection with air quality because people probably don't want to go outside if there are hazardous petrochemicals burning. And they would potentially need to be evacuated. So there would be costs associated with that. And more broadly, health costs, which we see time and time again with a lot of these air quality impacts, that they often affect the most vulnerable people in society. So people with conditions that make them more susceptible to air quality impacts. But what we did here is to map out by season. So using a NOAA model of airflow, depending on the season, what would the spread of some of those air pollutants like volatile organic compounds, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter, where would it be going? And so you can see there is some variation by season, but overall it would affect a wide area. Getting into the wildlife and habitat impacts. Again, a lot of this is water resource based. Air quality impacts could of course affect wildlife as well, but we particularly are focused on the water resource here because of the potential for the water to move downstream and interact with a lot of these sensitive wildlife areas. So we have some of them on the map here. There are estuaries and wetlands and wildlife refuge and wildlife areas, all of which, depending on, again, on how far downstream the material goes, could impact the species that are located there. Which, to give you a sense, inventories of species in this area have things like birds, fish, reptiles, many of which are not surprising, I'm sure, to you folks here, that these are on the endangered species list at the state or federal level, or sensitive species that we could cause very serious impacts to with releases. And some of those impacts include direct mortality. So this is the oiling and overall toxicity. And if that isn't the primary impact, the indirect mortality can also be through the loss of the food supply. Reproductive harm, especially with fish, this is something that's pretty well documented. For birds, oiling leading to hypothermia, loss of flight ability, inability to forage, drowning, and then the longer term toxicities like lung, liver, kidney damage. And then lastly here, the cultural resources. And we're thinking about this both for tribes and non-tribal members. I think many of us don't want to see an oil spill and would be harmed from a value standpoint that we hold for the river and that the site to see those occur. But especially for tribes, there's things like tribal treaty rights and impacts to subsistence and transportation, commerce and ceremonial values, and quite a few sensitive species that are here. And lastly, I think we want to end just by saying the impacts in this area would be the same as where the Portland Harbor Superfund site. And there has been a lot of work done on that. And the potential then is for cumulative impacts that would perpetuate the historic losses of cultural environmental values for this particular area. So that is the end of our presentation. Thank you for bearing with us. We had a whole lot to cover and not a lot of time. I might turn to John or Renee to facilitate the questions, because I know we have quite a lot in the chat. So
yeah, we've had an active chat throughout this whole period, which is awesome. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and then just a reminder, you can keep on adding questions into the chat, and then after we get through some of these that were posted on the chat, you can also raise your hand and we will call on you. So first question, and I'm going to pose this one to Adam. Who regulates the CEI hub?
Yeah, so there's, as you can imagine, a lot of different kind of overlapping regulations. So the city certainly has regulatory authority, the county, the state have different regulatory authorities, and then all the way up at the federal level, there's going to be things like the Clean Air Act and the Oil Pollution Act and the Clean Water Act that are all going to have different layers of requirements. And those are largely requirements that the CEI hub is already responding to. I think what we're also intending to do with the study is see what's being missed, what's not being covered, for instance, by the Oil Pollution Act, or potentially being forced upon individuals or a legal system.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like it's a patchwork, complicated picture, but it's something that we're trying to untangle. So there was a couple questions that they were answered in the chat, but I thought it might be just worth asking Allison to just talk about the design or the kind of the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake versus the Portland Hills fault line earthquake, and why we chose this one.
Yeah, so two very different earthquakes. One very close, the Portland Hills Fault's fairly close, or other crustal faults in the area as well. Those quakes are smaller areas of crust that break. They occur fairly quickly, so 45 seconds to a minute of strong shaking. They usually have about 10 to 20 cycles of really strong shaking that we consider important from an engineering standpoint. For a Cascadia subduction zone event, that's offshore, so it's farther away. The strength of the shaking when you get to the CEI hub is less than it would be from a Portland Hills fault. That's very true. The difference is we're going to have 3 to 6 minutes of shaking, and these earthquakes can have 100 to 200 cycles of shaking. So if you consider a paper clip, which is my favorite example, if you take it and you bend it really hard a couple times, it might not bend and break. But if you take it and you just sit there and wail on it for 3 minutes, you're eventually going to get it to break. So if you think about kind of the stress that's built up in soils, we can actually get a lot more stress built up in a subduction zone earthquake than we can in a crustal quake, depending on where we are. So the reason that we use Cascadia is because we know the risk very well. It's very well documented. We expect it to happen every 230 to 430 years, and we're at 321. So we're right smack dab in the middle of where we expect that to happen. There's magnitude 8 all the way through magnitude 9 that the patterns of breaking on the Cascadia subduction zone happen such that usually the southern half breaks no matter what. So Oregon is at a pretty big risk, whether it's an 8 or a 9. We know that earthquake's going to happen. It's a conveyor belt. The Portland Hills Fault, instead of hundreds of years recurrence interval, is more like thousands of years. And we have a lot less data on that and the other crustal faults. So the evidence that those events happen is on a much longer recurrence interval. So we know Cascadia is going to happen. So those are the two different scenarios. The reason we picked Cascadia to study in these events is A, we know it's going to happen and it's coming. 2, because of the duration of it, the damage at this CEI hub is probably going to be reasonably similar between the two quakes based on our calculations. We're going to have higher strength, but lower cycles. We don't consider slope stability and shaking happening at the same time, whereas you may actually start to get liquefaction during the shaking of a Cascadia event. So although it's a stronger shake, the higher estimates that we've put in this event probably cover that event. It's not going to be significantly worse in this location simply because this location is already very bad. So it's a reasonable assumption for planning and looking at all of these cases. And the other question I think was, there was one other one about that. John, am I forgetting one of the pieces? Oh, and then the crustal triggering the events. So yes, it has been shown the Chile quake that happened in 2010 did initiate a 7.0 on a crustal quake. That said, we've been studying this type of geology for decades. It happens on a millions of year scale, and we have very little data to show that it happens. In all of our study of CSZ and Portland Hills Fault, we don't have any evidence. I'm not saying it hasn't happened. We don't have any evidence that the Portland Hills Fault has happened in the last few Cascadia quakes. So it's potentially that there's been a trigger there, but we have no evidence that it happens. It could happen.
I hope by her answer, you can tell that Allison knows her stuff. So Jonna, how do we know if the out of service tanks are not a concern?
Out of service tanks are presumably empty. Tanks get inspected periodically for compliance with building code. I don't think we get out there as often we would like, but they get checked. And so if a tank was not empty, then that would be noted in building code compliance. And it's really, in a lot of ways, in the in the company's interest to make tanks appear to be in use if they are in use, because if they're out of use for a certain amount of time, then they're like considered defunct, and then it's much harder to ever use them again. And so it's in their interest to keep it up, basically.
Thank you. This is another one for you. Will the Zenith Lux permit be denied because of this information?
I am
a loaded question.
No, the land use compatibility statement is, I'm going to get over my head here. I work in emergency management, and that is a permit that's in front of the Bureau of Development Services. I don't think that this study speaks directly to the criteria that BDS is required by the code to consider. So to my understanding, it would not influence it, but I'm not an attorney and I don't work at the Bureau of Development Services, so that's a layperson's understanding.
Thank you. Maybe this is, I'm not sure, one of the consultant team, if the newest tanks are still susceptible to connection failure, shouldn't post-93 pre-2004 tanks be prone to connection failures? And if so, why just up to 10%?
Connections. So if it was built after 2004, there's likely some flexible connections included. The typical design of things has included flexible connections since then. Granted, we did not go look at the tanks, but that is typical design after 2004. So we anticipate that, or even since 93, they've been including flexible connections. So the 10% is showing that we anticipate that there will be some damage on tanks and connections that have been designed for this. Containment issues, there's always the potential that something is damaged. Engineering is not 100% positive. We don't know how it's been maintained since it was installed, so there's always a chance. But we gave them the benefit of the doubt, said if it was designed since 2004, that they have included all the things that they knew about and should have, because it went through City of Portland building code, building development services, who are pretty good at checking this stuff. So we're giving them the benefit of the doubt that the majority of it works, but we're saying, hey, we all know stuff happens. It's potential that there's a 10% leak. We didn't want to say 0, but I think 10% is a reasonable guess for newer tanks.
Great, thank you for explaining that. So we've gotten a couple of great suggestions to enhance the study so far. One was from Paul, who said that Vigor is just across the river there in Swan Island, along with a lot of other industrial sources. And, the oil spill might have an impact on the economic activity that's pretty important, for the region there. So I'm just going to note that. I also saw Bob Salinger weighing in here from Portland Audubon, who's probably the most knowledgeable person about wildlife issues that I know personally. So Bob, if you're still on, do you mind just kind of talking about the comment that you gave in the chat?
Sure. Yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity. I was just saying that I think it would be helpful to catalog the species that would be vulnerable to catastrophic impacts. We tend to focus on federally listed and imperiled species, but the lower Columbia, during certain times of the year is home to very significant populations of more common species. And I think, for example, of the Caspian tern colony on East Sand Island and the double-crested cormorant colony also that was on East Sand Island, where you have the world's largest colony of Caspian terns all in one place at one time. And although they're relatively common, an oil spill of this magnitude, could result, in catastrophic impacts. So I think it's really important to kind of try and capture those populations that are out there that people may not be thinking about. Salmon, obviously, and, species that we think about regularly in terms of impacts. But, from Portland to the estuary, it's just a string of wildlife refuges. So I think really capturing that and the magnitude of wildlife impacts. I'd also add that we are completely unprepared for an oil spill. Audubon has the largest rehab center in Oregon. We don't handle oil spills, but my experience is that we are just utterly unprepared for dealing with the wildlife impacts if we had a major oil spill in Oregon.
Thanks, Bob. That's sobering stuff.
I can't help but pipe in. We're unprepared for an oil spill on a blue sky day, and certainly probably the day after an earthquake would be the hardest day to mount a response.
Maybe Alice, I saw something in there from Mike about secondary containment. Is that, how much is that going to contain, and is there a way that we can enhance that? Allison, is maybe a question for you?
Yes. So our environmental side looked back through what DEQ requirements are. And in general, the requirements for containment of a tank farm are they should be able to contain, I think it's 110% of the largest tank, because they're assuming that not all of the tanks fail at the same time. So there's there's concrete or some type of containment that if a tank fails, it is contained in a berm of whatever sort it is that they have out there. And again, this is based on what we understand from what's been built out there. We didn't get out onto these sites. They're concrete walls, they're soil berms. So if you have liquefaction and lateral spread, you can have damage to those areas. So we assumed that containment would not work. Also, we're assuming that it is not, or it's included in the percentages that we expect that it's not going to be 100% contained. And on top of that, more tanks are going to fail than just the largest tank in a berm area, because there's several areas where there's multiple tanks included. So yes, there are ways that you could do secondary containment and install better containment, so that if the tanks fail, that you could keep it closer to the tanks if the tanks do fail. In the areas where you actually have liquefaction and lateral spread, that's going to require something flexible, something that's designed to handle that with design and lateral spread. And you're probably going to be doing some sort of ground improvement included, which is difficult to do under, it's not impossible, and it is probably less expensive. It's way less expensive than any of this cleanup. But at that point, you'd probably be doing ground improvement to improve the entire situation, not just the secondary containment.
I'm going to note a quick from one of our NET volunteers. Thank you for volunteering for NET. I know we depend on you all so much. But Diane mentions a really interesting kind of secondary impact from a spill, the spill that will occur there. Is it going to siphon off resources from neighborhood response? Because, if you there's going to be disaster everywhere, but this is going to be kind of like the worst part of the disaster. Jonna, do you want to take that, or maybe so that's something that our project team can note too?
I would just say briefly, because Portland Fire has also thought much about this and have discussed it, that they have response plans for earthquake, and primarily it will be hard to travel across the city. It would not be possible for like fire trucks from all over across the city to come to the CEI hub after an earthquake, nor would that be their goal. They're going to try and each help folks in their fire management area, the area that's served by their fire station. If folks there is fire resources that serve Linton, and so their response will be to save lives in Linton, that will be related to this spill. But in terms of like kind of traditional hazmat response, like they would normally do in a blue skies event after an earthquake, the environmental protections, unfortunately, they just are not going to have capacity to address that. So hazmat response and cleanup is something that would come later after they've done everything to protect people and save lives, put out fires.
Thanks, Jonna. I saw that we had Senator Dembrow on here. I would note that there was a reference to a bill that would kind of give more authority to DEQ over the hub. I think Paul mentioned that. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else about that, Paul.
Yes, NAACP Portland Environmental Justice Committee plans to find a legislative sponsor to reintroduce Senate Bill 95 from 2019, which would give DEQ regulatory power over the CEI and prohibit operation unless there was a seismic risk mitigation plan. So we're looking for partners in that, and some of the partners that we have are in the room today or tonight. And also, I'm curious at this point, with the expertise in this room, what the arguments are for and against DEQ regulation, and if people feel that that is a sufficient step or a step in the right direction. Thank you.
I'm not sure who from the panel wants to tackle that. Maybe one of our commissioners has a thought on that. Not to throw you in the hot seat here.
I mean, you know, my off-the-cuff response is any regulation that we can get to bear on the CEI hub is useful. So I'm not sure I have a more considered response than that.
Thank you.
But if Senator Dembrow is here, we could certainly throw him into the hot seat.
We would love to hear from him.
And
Yu-Mei Wang has, one of the authors of the original CEI report, has identified the CEI as a particular environmental justice issue threatening historic Black neighborhoods, as many other neighborhoods as well. And so that's one reason that NAACP is particularly concerned. Well, no word from Senator Dembrow, so we'll see.
Well,
thank you.
To be fair,
and I imagine that we will be in contact with Senator Dembrow, and I just, one thing that I would mention, that it's not directly this is not a legislative response, but really our goal is to identify some approaches that we can take, you know, try to think outside the box so that we are addressing in this way, that we are addressing the potential to prevent a disaster and to bear the risk of the costs for damages in the event of a disaster. And so, you know, this is the reason the report is in draft form right now, is that the study authors have wanted to ensure we're capturing all the impacts, and we will be talking to some other folks and communicating with others, such as tribal governments and other partners, understanding what we're missing. But once the process is complete, we can, and we should be thinking about this now, of course, but we can assess what the potential policy solutions could be. So for example, one thing I've been thinking about is the possibility of ensuring the fossil fuel companies have appropriate insurance or bonds to pay the cost for all of the significant damages that could occur in a disaster. And that the cost of bearing that insurance could be more, it could be more economical for them to maybe do the retrofitting that could prevent some of the damage that could occur. And so, you know, the aim here has always been to inform an approach that can hold industry accountable for being part of the solution here for preparedness and disaster recovery. And our community obviously bears such tremendous risk, and the industry responsible for the landscape of that risk should definitely be part of the solution, and not just after the fact, but part of preventing the kind of damage that we're looking at here.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mark asks about the unknown information about Zenith tanks, particularly given the hazardous nature. I don't know, Laura, do you have anything that you want to chime in here about that?
Sure. And someone else had a related question that I'll just jump in with now too, which is, are we sending this information out to the owners and operators of these facilities? Which is, yes, we are hoping by releasing this now before the report is finalized that we can fill in those gaps. And so as it stands now, we are missing data on the Zenith smaller tanks. I do want to clarify, all the big ones that are the primary fuel storage tanks, we do have information on, but they do have quite a few of these smaller tanks, and you can see them on an aerial photo of the ones I'm talking about there. And those we are missing information on what's in them and when they were built, that sort of thing.
Great. And I saw an interesting comment from Fiona. I don't know, do you want to talk about that yourself, or would you want me to kind of try to paraphrase it a little bit?
I am lost in the chat, so I'd love you to repeat it.
I was wondering if Fiona is
Oh,
here
gotcha.
and wanting to unmute her themselves.
Yes, hello. I suppose one thing I wanted to highlight, I guess my impression was that this report the motivation behind this report is to, like there's a lot of talk about imposing financial accountabilities on, financial accountabilities on these oil companies as a means of incentivizing them to retrofit their tanks, to take whatever action is needed to go. I want to problematize that. I want to question what precedent there is for believing that is something that will work just because of the history, excuse me. The federal government has been fining these oil companies for oil spills since 1990. And many more have, you know, the owners of BP have continued paying for these spills up to this day. And largely speaking, they've done so by just selling assets. And I guess what I'm saying is, do we have any reason to believe that this is something, especially as these companies are continuing to build more oil infrastructure, even as their investors are pulling out? Do we have any reason to believe that this is going to be enough of an incentive when ultimately, even if the cleanup fines would ultimately add up to more money, when you're talking about an oil company, it's all going to be kind of a drop in the bucket either way. I guess kind of an unintentional pun there.
Would one of the commissioners, would you want to tackle that question? Like, is this, I guess the fundamental question is imposing financial surety mechanisms onto the oil companies. Do we think that's going to be enough of an incentive for them to prevent, you know, catastrophic failures at these facilities, especially in light of, you know, bad action elsewhere throughout the country?
Well, Commissioner Jayapal.
Go ahead.
Well, I would just start by saying what we don't know is the short answer, and we you know, particularly at the county, do not have sort of obvious regulatory authority over you know, over the CEI hub or over the industrial players that that store their fuel here. And so what we're trying to do is, you know, is convene groups of both local and involve our state leaders and even our federal delegation in thinking about what the solutions could be at each step of the process. But one of the things that we could do, having to think outside the box, again, as the county, we have very little, if any, direct authority to do something to regulate the CEI hub. But this concept of a surety or, you know, making them responsible for the damage, you know, the cost of the damages that could be incurred, or ideally having so much financial investment they'd have to engage in to avoid that future that they would just retrofit or do something better. That is an idea, and it was actually brought to our attention by a group at Center for Sustainable Economy, and it's sort of a thing that we could think about to move the dial. And so the effort here is to identify even the scope of the dial we need to move. We all know that this is catastrophic. And so what can we do? And we need to pull every lever that we can to have an impact. So this is one of those levers. And are we sure it would work? No, we would be on the cutting edge of actually doing this. But it's better than not doing anything. So Commissioner Jayapal, did you have a
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say the exact same thing, really, is that no, we don't know for sure, but we won't know unless we do this analysis. And so the step of figuring out what that financial risk looks like and, you know, how much would they bond against, that's something that that's a step that we have to take in order to be able to assess whether or not it mitigates. And, you know, just completely really echo what Commissioner Myron said, which I think it was part of my response to the question about having DEQ have expanded regulatory authority, is that we do need to examine at every level of government what is there that can be done, because the scope of this is so large that there is probably not one policy, a single policy solution. It has to be an array of connected policy solutions. I think the only other thing I would add is that one of the other reasons that I have been interested in this study is that that tool of risk bonding or insurance or something could be applied to other contexts. And, you know, a number of the chat questions mentioned Zenith, the oil trains. Those oil trains run through my district. They run through the Cully neighborhood. They run through dense urban residential areas, parks and schools. And again, simply is the wrong word, dealing with the financial risk isn't by any stretch of the imagination a complete solution, but it is an approach that could be applied in other contexts as well. So are we sure that this is going to do everything that we want it to do? Nope, but we've got to do the analysis to find out, and we've got to try as many different strategies as we can.
Thank you, commissioners. I posted a link since you mentioned oil trains or oil by rail. The county did a study several years ago looking at that, and you can look at some of the results via that link that I posted. So I'm going to ask a few questions together, and I think it'd be obvious who's going to answer. So how far would the air quality impacts spread, and what would the impacts be? Also, will there be a fire in Forest Park, on the river, or in St. John's? Do we know that, or do we assume that? And is evacuation planning, like apparently there's, you know, some 50,000 people that might need to be evacuated. Is that those costs and impacts part of the study? So maybe Adam, we can start with you. Any one of those three questions that you want to tackle?
Yeah, so I'll start with the air quality. So how far and how bad will they be? The thing about that model, and it's pretty neat, the ones that created those 4 maps, is it models on a given day in a season kind of a ball of particulate matter going up. And so you see one of the outputs is also kind of this vertical trajectory of it. So eventually, you know, this plume does disperse, does get into the upper atmosphere, but it doesn't for a little while. So I would certainly expect, depending on wind conditions, for those areas downwind, and again, depending on season, but it looks largely in summer, there's a pretty stable northward flow. And then in summer, a pretty stable eastward flow, that those communities would see substantial air quality reductions. The fall and the spring are much more variable. It's going to depend on the day. You know, the wind could be blowing one way one day, the other way the other day. So there, it's not that there's going to be necessarily a cloud over the whole city, as much as we just don't know. It's hard to predict where it's going to go. And what those impacts are is they're bad. It's you know, as you can imagine, the particulate matter, the VOCs, nitrous oxides, these are all things that are already heavily regulated for both point source pollutants as well as ambient air quality standards. And there's a lot of studies that look at those air quality impacts, and we will be including those. Again, a lot of these impacts occur at the margin, and it's for people that are more susceptible to health conditions. So it's going to be people with asthma, people with other health conditions. But as everyone in Portland experienced last September, and pretty much for many of the summers in recent memory, I think we all know what poor air quality looks and feels like and how bad it can be. But I would expect this to be worse than that. And I think there's a third question there that
sorry. Worse than that is sobering. Will there be fire in Forest Park, on the river, and in St. John's? And then for Jonah, there'll be a question about evacuation planning, and has that been factored into the report?
Yeah, so great question. The extent of where the fire spreads is definitely going to be a seasonal effect. I think ideally it wouldn't spread. If it does, it would be a spread through structures, not necessarily through the flow of oil to Forest Park. But it's certainly possible. A big part of managing fire and emergency response is the ability to dispatch equipment to deal with it. And I think that's another one of these big variables is all of this is happening within the context of a major disaster. And what we're really trying to focus our study on is what are kind of the marginal effects. But I think we largely are expecting the ability to respond to the fires or the spill be greatly limited than we would in any other condition. And then on top of that, the oil spills, when they end up in rivers, they close rivers, they close shipping channels. It's happened numerous times in the Houston shipping channel and caused substantial economic costs there. Not only are the kind of bread and butter economic costs of that river closure going to matter, it's the ability to use that river as a transportation network for responding to a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. That's also going to be hampered as well.
And John, do you want to say anything about anything else about that?
Let's see, evacuations. The city of Portland has an evacuation plan that looks at special areas that might have difficulties to evacuate, like Hayden Island, and Linton is definitely one. Folks who live there already know there's one road in, there's one road out. It's prone to landslides. The forest is there. This has a lot of hazards. We keep our evacuation plan up to date. We try and exercise it at least every 3 years, like practice it. And we usually pick Linton as a place where we practice it. We've had awesome partnership with our nets there in thinking through how we do that. But also, obviously, evacuation is like the worst case scenario when you're trying to leave from an area. And I think we can all just imagine that the chaos that might follow after a massive earthquake would really complicate efforts to evacuate. So there's not a happy story there, but insofar we are using all the resources that we have, and in partnership with the community are trying to be as prepared as we can be to address what is undeniably a big risk.
Thank you. I've seen a couple of questions. I'm going to ask maybe Nancy to talk about just some of these daily risks to air quality. Nancy, are you able to unmute yourself and just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Nancy Heiser here with Linton Neighborhood Association and the NET team. We have been actively involved in looking at our air quality. Diesel particulate, industrial toxins, certainly the fuel tanks. The fuel tanks have floating lids, a number of them, and the tank farm owners offer throughout the country, offer some modeling data about how much of their chemicals are released into the air. 2 studies have come out fairly recently in Maine and Massachusetts, in which those communities actually measured the emissions from those tanks, and it was up to 30 times higher than the modeling studies indicated. So we are right now trying to actually get some measuring going on. We've requested support from the DEQ to do that. And was that the sum of your question, John?
Yeah, Nancy, thank you, and thank you for your advocacy on that issue. Please, let's work on that together. Air quality is one of my passions, so I'd love to partner with you on that and help leverage our connections with DEQ, because I think that's a really important issue as well.
We've got a condo in Linton waiting for you. It's going on the market, John. Come
I'm up here in Cully, Nancy. I'm pretty committed to my neighborhood. But we've got our own issues too. All right, I've lost track a little bit of the chat here. Does anybody else have a verbal question they want to ask while I kind of catch up a little bit?
What are the tribal interests? And who's representing the tribes? Is there anyone in the room?
Thank you very much for that question. Jonna, do you want to respond to that while I catch up on the chat?
Sure. So we tribes are sovereign nations, and so we at the City of Portland, and I believe the county is the same. We try not to lump them in with sort of public comment, but rather to offer government to government consultation. So we have sent a letter to the tribal chairpersons of all the Columbia River Treaty tribes and other tribes that have indicated they have an interest in the Willamette or Columbia River water. It provided them with the results of the study and asked for the opportunity to meet for the appropriate person from their tribe to talk through it and receive their feedback. We have one, maybe two of those meetings scheduled so far, but I continue to hope that more tribes will be interested in this process, and certainly there's no time limit on their engagement, so we hope to hear from them now, but we'll accept their feedback and incorporate it when we get it. I agree that's really important.
Thanks, Jonna. Lynn Hanlon, you have your hand up.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I did that on purpose or not. Something I want to say, is this the time? Well, we have somebody here from Dan Ryan's office, and I would like to know if we can hear from them about how they're going to deny the Lux to Zenith. It seems like Zenith Energy, of all of the things there, is the low-hanging fruit, that it does no good for the state of Oregon, doesn't provide fuel for us. It's a giant hazard. Their oil trains are a nightmare through the gorge and in Portland and here. We know all that. And, you know, their facility, they've got the tar sand crude oil, so it's the really nasty stuff. So I'm wondering if we can hear from Dan Ryan's office about, yes, they're finally going to actually deny the Lux so that we can shut that down and at least lower the risk a little bit.
I know we had talked about letting staff from council offices weigh in during the meeting today. We're thinking towards the end, but I don't know if that's something you wanted to respond to now, or we can wait a little bit.
I will defer to the group on this one, but hi everyone, I'm Margot. I'm from Commissioner Dan Ryan's office. I'm his communication strategist. So if now is a good time, I can say a couple of things, but I don't want to jump on any agenda stuff.
Sure, that's fine. Why don't you, since it was sort of raised directly, so if you can respond, that'd be great. And then I totally agree that Zenith is an important thing to talk about, but we also are hoping tonight to benefit from the assembled wisdom of this group about all things related to the hub and the impacts of an earthquake there. And so just want to kind of set that context as well.
Well, I will keep this very brief as much as I possibly can. So thank you for the question. And Commissioner Ryan wanted to apologize for not being able to be here tonight. It is on his radar though, and he has read through the report. There are not a lot of things I can give you right now because we are in very deep consultation with our city attorneys about what we have as legal options. And so unfortunately, I'm a little bit bound by confidentiality with what I'm able to provide you with right now. I recognize how frustrating that is. Trust me, I've gotten frustrated too. But we're getting closer to a more definitive action plan is kind of what I can say for right now. And we will have updates for you within the week. We don't have that for right now. And Commissioner Ryan is very supportive of any efforts by the county commissioners to make more of a broad push against what Zenith has done in certain spaces. We just need a little bit more time to get our ducks in a row. And so the approximate timeline that you're looking for there is the end of the month is when we need to make a definitive Lux statement. And yeah, I'm going to kind of leave it at that for right now, but hopefully that helps a little bit. And just know that it's very much on our radar and something we've been dedicating a lot of staff time to.
Thank you, Margot. I saw that Paul S. had a hand up.
Yeah, hi, thanks for letting me speak. I guess I wanted to understand why the east shore of the river was excluded entirely from the scope of the report, or it seemed to be from my reading of it. Is that the case, or because obviously the impacts will extend far beyond just the tank farms and the grounds attached to it. So I was wondering if you guys could the question about that. I didn't see 97203 included in the scope of the report, for example.
Yeah, thanks. So let me comment on that. So if you mean the east bank of the Willamette River, that certainly is within the scope of our report, and we are evaluating that. We are not looking beyond the city of Portland and Multnomah County. We are not looking into Washington, although, as you can imagine, at least for those kind of direct community level impacts, we are looking at the environmental resources farther downstream on the river.
I noticed though that 97203 is the St. John's and North Portland Peninsula zip code, and it was not included in the zip codes that were in scope in either of the reports I looked at. So,
thanks. We'll look back into that. Thank you.
Awesome. I saw Fiona just about our intentions for this meeting. Our intention for this meeting is to sort of have a broad, open community meeting, and we've tried to reach as many people that would be interested as possible for tonight's meeting. We're certainly not just sending letters. We're working with our tribal liaisons and our government relations teams to, connect with tribal governments and doing that in a way that is respectful of their sovereignty as sovereign nations. So that's certainly happening. And then beyond tonight's meeting, we're certainly speaking for John and myself. We're open to dive deeper with other groups, and we'll certainly be continuing to do outreach throughout this process. All right, can one of my teammates here help me out? Do we have any other hands raised?
Yeah, so there's a question in the chat about downstream water intake. So we have looked at community infrastructure, particularly looking through NESDIS permits downstream. It's not clear currently on how we'll kind of grapple with those impacts, but we are looking at kind of all uses of the river downstream of the site.
And was that water intake, that's like for drinking water, Adam?
Yeah, and I don't know that we found specific water intakes, but there's certainly a lot of different outflows and other intakes along the river that would potentially be impacted, or would have to at least shut down during the event.
And sorry, I just had a question pop into my mind, but is there any chance this would impact groundwater?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, certainly it could. And if it did, it would be more of a long-term impact. It wouldn't, generally these types of spills, certainly once it gets to the river, it's not something that migrates into the groundwater, but certainly any of these facilities that have been kind of fueling depots in the past, they tend to have groundwater impacts. And in some cases, I worked on a site in San Francisco where so much fuel has been spilled over time that it was actually seeping out at the shore level. So I think even all that oil landing on the ground is going to be a problem and potentially a long-term issue.
Thank you. Barbara Quinn has her hand up. Or their hand up.
Sorry about that. Yeah, this is a really interesting study. It's got great information, but it's a little disturbing because I'm not sure what the goal here is. I mean, is the goal to find methods or ways to address the problem of this slow motion disaster we know is going to happen? I mean, it's like watching all the work that we've done on the Superfund just disappear. If once this disaster happens and once these tanks erupt or whatever they're going to do during a large earthquake, it's too late. There's no way we can even address that kind of impact. I mean, we don't have funds, we don't have bandwidth, we don't have, I mean, the impacts to the communities are just going to be disastrous. Why aren't we thinking prevention? I've always wondered this. The DEQ says the stuff has to be in the water before they can consider it something to address. Well, by that time, it's too late. Can we do anything for prevention, I guess is what I'm wondering.
Commissioner Myron or Jayapal, did you want to tackle that one? I mean, it seems I would say that the study is premised on the idea of prevention, but maybe you can expound on that.
I'd be happy to jump it a little bit. I mean, Barbara, you know, I think no argument that we want to do prevention, and the pieces of this study that could point us in prevention, folks have pointed out that we don't really know, but if the cost, excuse me, is sufficient enough to create the incentive for the owners of the tanks to retrofit and mitigate, that's one avenue for prevention. And then I think we come back to, we do also have to look at other jurisdictions that have more authority than Multnomah County does to do the kind of regulation that would really get us to prevention. We have to look at DEQ, we have to look at the state, we have to look at federal to see what we can do. So this is, again, this is one of any number of strategies that we think we need to pursue in order to really get to where we want to be. Commissioner Myron, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, that's absolutely, absolutely right. I mean, we're always thinking about prevention and how we can intervene upstream, no pun intended there, but to make an impact so that we can prevent the type of disaster that this clearly, that is clearly demonstrated here. And so, I mean, that is certainly my goal in looking at this. I mean, by the time you know, for example, one of the fuel companies would be paying for the damages, it's way too late. I mean, that damage is, like you said, Barbara, is just really beyond catastrophic. So yes, the goal is ultimately prevention, but as part of that, we do need to be able to characterize and quantify risk so that we are able to know, like, where we can move to do that prevention work, and what the levers are that we might have at our disposal. And as Commissioner Jayapal mentioned, there are few at the county, but we can advocate for and partner with our colleagues at different levels of government to be able to pull those levers. And but that's what the goal of, you know, part of the goal of this study in identifying and characterizing risk is to be able to even know what we have there. You know, they've been these mysterious, just giant tanks that are ancient that we know are filled with really awful stuff on liquefiable soil. You know, like, it's horrifying, but we haven't known what the reality was. Now we have finally at least taken that step to describe what that is and then to quantify it so that we can do whatever's within our power to prevent, ideally.
Great, thank you. So we've got about 20 minutes left and we've got a few people in the queue to ask questions. There's a great comment from Mary Frost just about floating morages in the Columbia River Channel downstream from the hub. I thought that was a good one for us to note. I'm gonna call on Audrey Zed, then Jessica Rojas, Alice, and Howard Shapiro. Diane, we'll go start with those three. So Audrey, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hello. I didn't know I had my hand up. Thank you for calling on me. I first just want to thank the commissioners for looking at this. This is just really, it's terrifying, but it's also really hopeful that we're getting out in front of this. And I appreciate bringing up the possibility of Deepwater Horizon as kind of an image of an illustration of how bad this could be. And I think, you know, the news media listening in hopefully can, you know, set that as the context of what we're talking about, and that we have the chance to actually get ahead of this disaster is scary, but I find hope there. And my questions really are for the folks putting together this study, just looking at the different domains you're talking about. I wonder, what about emergency response for the earthquake that's just happened when this hub is liquefied? What is the impact going to be on the emergency responders in terms of, is fuel going to be disrupted? Is jet fuel going to be a problem? How much will we be less able to respond to the earthquake that has hit the entire city, the entire region, how will our emergency response to the earthquake be impacted or damaged because of the damage to this one location? I guess that's just that's just a factor. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, no,
thank you.
It's a great question. And I would say that this isn't going to help, and it's definitely going to hurt. I think everything you've mentioned, from the fuel, the burning, the lack of able to bring in additional fuel. Anybody who's ever been in a hurricane response area knows that that's kind of one of the things you have to deal with, is lines at gas stations. But also, as I mentioned, the inability to use the river as a resource. So we're keeping all of those things in mind. And this is one of the great things of working with John and Jonna, who are in charge of emergency response in their respective jurisdictions, so that we can definitely integrate those concerns and try to address them as well, because it's not just a bunch of tanks rupturing, it's a bunch of tanks rupturing in a world that there's already going to be a lot else that we're going to have to deal with.
Great.
And
Jessica Rojas.
Oh, and could I just really briefly respond to that? I really appreciate that question, because you know, it is one of the elephants in the room. I wonder if Alice, I think Alice Bush is on the call, and she is involved in our Office of Emergency Management at the Division of Emergency Management at the county. I don't mean to put her on the spot, but I don't know if you might be able to speak to that if you are available, Alice, because I know there's tremendous thinking about this.
I'm the emergency manager for the city of Portland, so I maybe could share just similarly that, I mean, this is a problem for our region and really for the whole state. As I think we said at the beginning, like 90% of the fuel in Oregon comes through the fuel hub, and most gas stations only have a 2 or 3 day supply in them. So our planning assumptions for an earthquake right now are that after an earthquake, the fuel that you have in your tanks is all that is the fuel that you have to work with potentially for many weeks. The state has developed some emergency fuel plans to deliver fuel by helicopter, but we would expect that would go just to most critical uses. So to keep ventilators running at hospitals, or to keep generators running at emergency coordination centers. But we would need so much fuel to clean up and do all the public works of cleaning up after an earthquake, and it would just tremendously delay our response, obviously, to have no fuel and no fuel infrastructure. So it's a big statewide problem that is imperfectly factored into our plans now.
And John, I probably note also that not only is it a known problem, but I mean, the state resilience officer as well as the state are doing statewide planning events around how to work at this. And some of it is adding redundancy. So looking at other options from having fuel supply from different places, and then just multiple storage areas, so that keeping it in the separate counties and other areas of the city, so that it's not all stored there and we have some backup. So outside of our study, there is a lot of work going on in this particular area because it's recognized to be a very big problem. But like Jonah said, the impact is huge.
Thanks. Okay, Jessica, do you want to go? Did we lose Jessica? Maybe if you're there, I'm going to ask Alice and Howard Shapiro to go, and then if you're there, just jump back in and you can go next.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on Commissioner Myron's suggestion that we quantify the cost and so on. And one of my questions is, will that be done before we find ourselves in the position of the ex-residents of Paradise, California, where the fire devoured the town in 15 minutes from the beginning of it, 7 miles away? Now, I think it's very important that we have this information so that we can move forward on the idea of bonding, making these oil companies bond and insure to take care of the damage done by this possible conflagration that happens, because and also another part of the question is, can the Southeast Hills, in the event of the fire using up the fuel in the hub and jumping the highway, moving up into Forest Park, burning that fuel and coming down into the city? Now, the people in Southeast or in the hills, they're two-lane highways, and they'll run into the same problem that the Paradise people ran into. They couldn't evacuate. They were bumper to bumper. So those are good questions to think about, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I also want to thank the commissioners for doing this study. Similar ideas have been brought before the city in times past, so I'm hoping that this study doesn't take too much longer. We know from information from our fire chief here in Portland and from Zenith itself that they would not be able to put out a fire should it happen at their industrial hub. So I think since we know some of these things, I'm just wondering why some preventive measures can't begin right now. I don't know who has the authority, but this really is a public health issue for ourselves and for other species. There's no question that we would lose birds, fish, other species, agricultural land, you know, our pretty much whole way of being. So I'm just hoping that whatever measures can be taken right now would start. I don't want to wait until the disaster's here and we're, you know, I just want to say, I know Commissioner Ryan has been working on homeless issues. We'll all be homeless, or lots of us will be homeless and dead when this happens. So I know I sound passionate. It's not just for me, it's for my grandkids and everybody else's and all the species that were mentioned by Audubon and everything. We're already under enough environmental stress. So please do what you can, and thank you.
Great. And is there any response, commissioners, to that, or do we want to move on to our next speaker? We don't have a ton of time, just noting that.
I would just say thank you for those comments.
Okay, Diane, do you mind going next, please?
Yes, I just want to thank the commissioners and the city PBIM for having the courage to tell the truth here. And I guess what I'm most concerned about is whether or not anybody's going to have the courage to stand up to the powerful players and do the hard steps that are action steps that need to be taken. And I was quite concerned that policies, suggested policies, weren't laid out in this report. Certainly there's things, best practices from around the country, but even if we're starting from scratch, you know, we could start deny the lux. We can require an upgrade to current seismic requirements. We can begin the process of deconcentrating such risky facilities and that were in an ill-planned location. We can insist on the risk bonds and insurance to the full extent, like you mentioned. But we really also need to begin the process of annual decarbonization of at least 10% a year in really concrete steps to get us where we need to be to address the climate chaos that is happening all around us. And every day, I'm sure there's other things you're thinking about, which I'd really love you to speak to, but every day delayed threatens an unthinkable disaster. And I feel like this is the time where that courage to act is what we need most from our electeds. And I'm not talking to the county commissioners at this point. I'm talking to our city council, who none of them are here. And I find that appalling.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for
I mean,
that.
but I'd like to hear any of you in terms of the policies.
I mean, so I'll just say quickly that I think that all those policies and more are being kind of discussed, and what the purpose of the study isn't necessarily, it's not necessarily a policy analysis, although there'll be more of the legal analysis kind of coming in as this as it wraps up. But then there's more work for us to then take the information from the report and turn it into ordinances and other things. So we're working and have worked a lot with legal teams and others to think about what our next steps on this can be. I do want to make sure that a few other people have a chance to speak. So Jim Emerson, are you still with us? Would you
I'm here.
Excellent.
Is this working?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Yeah, again, thank you to everyone involved and everyone listening. I think Diane went in a direction I'd like to not so much emphasize for immediate use, but I think the oil companies are there and the pipelines are there, not just for their own profit. They're there because Oregonians and businesses and so on use fossil fuels. And if this, as people have said, horrific catastrophe probability isn't enough of an incentive to speed up the transition away from fossil fuels, I don't know what would be. It seems like a lot of the money that could be put into, for example, relocating the entire fossil fuel hub and just having another one somewhere else, which also would be subject to earthquake damage, could be put into a much speeded up, dramatic decarbonization. Oregon could become a leader in that, goaded by the probability of the earthquake happening here, as well as by the climate change things. But climate change, as critical as it is, isn't something that's right in our face with, well, I shouldn't say this after last month, but with death producing elements to wide populations. And this is something that if Oregon could lead on this within a 5 or 10 year period, we could get to the point where we wouldn't need all those tanks. Or maybe we would only need the ones that have been built since 2004 for emergency vehicles and stuff. So again, this isn't something that is part of this study, but I'm just stating this so that officials can think about this in their agencies and offices. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. I'm seeing a lot of support for your comments. John Howell?
Yes, good evening, everyone. Turn on my camera. Hey, good evening. So very interesting overview of the CEI and the risks that it poses. I live downstream from the CEI hub, so we are downstreamers and will suffer the consequences of anything that happens on the site. So question, and I've seen the city and this county and the state, because it is such a large scale problem, why not pay the companies to relocate? You know, we complain about the profits they incur, and we complain about, you know, why don't they do something? But carrots work better than sticks. And the city or the county or the state has also been engaged in Oregon solutions with regards to the levee, understanding the risk is posed by the failure of the levees along the Columbia River. And if the incentive is there, I would suggest that would be a solution that would be most promising, and it would not leave it to a stick to beat someone around the head trying to make them move when they're not going to move, and just incentivize them and say, hey, we'll move you. Tell us where you'd like to go, not here. And also related to that would be permits. Deny permits going forward. Don't expand the facility in any way that could exacerbate or worsen the potential risk associated with this evaluation. So
I do have a couple comments on that one just from an engineering perspective. So you definitely can fix them where they are, and new infrastructure actually will be designed to withstand these problems. So I'm not advocating for new oil infrastructure by any means, but new infrastructure would provide us with a more sustainable fuel situation. And one of the things to think about is not just where they are, but where this comes in. So these fuel hubs are there because they bring the fuel in by water onto the docks that they have there, and that's where the pipelines go. So if you're going to move these facilities, then we have to redo our pipelines, redo our docks, come up with how they're going to get the oil there. It's a much bigger issue than just moving storage tanks. And so again, I am entirely not saying that we need new carbon infrastructure, but I am saying that new carbon infrastructure will be seismically designed and hardened, whereas the old infrastructure is not. So that's true for the pipelines because none of our pipelines have been built recently. That is true for all of the dock structures down there, and that's true for most of the tanks. So, and not saying that moving it is not an option. One of the things they're looking at from the state plan is diversifying our storage. So it may still have to come in there because that's where the infrastructure is to accept it until we update that infrastructure or come up with another place for it to come in. But we are looking at taking it from there to other places so we have more diverse storage throughout the state. And that is part of a bigger study that's still ongoing, knowing that this is a problem. So it is, unfortunately, when you start to get to just moving it, it's a much bigger problem than just moving the tanks. And there's been several questions about whether they can fix it. They can fix it in situ as well.
Thanks, Allison. I appreciate that. Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. I might pronounce this wrong, Jiro. If you don't mind closing us out with a question, and we'll
Thank you. Thank you for time. And yeah, thank you very much for making this event and amazing content, and very informed. And it's still a little bit shocking. I knew it's there, but it's a little bit shocking, so take a little bit time to digest. And I think this is beginning, so it's a more brainstorming, like widening time, I believe. And I happen to have lots of Japanese background, and Japan seems to be pretty ready for lots of earthquakes. So I want to share just a little bit off, but just conceptual sharing, which we use a lot of resilience and sustainable. But in Japan, resilience, the word resilience getting a little bit getting old. So nowadays, what people say is disaster recovery before happening recovery, before happening disaster. So that's, I feel a little more new and more fresh hearing that word. And one more thing is earthquake. It's just an inspirational thing, nothing almost connected to this topic, but after a big earthquake, we're going to have lots of debris, lots of debris. And some creative people thinking, some part of Japan is dead sea, not much fish there. So they're planning to put these debris into certain spots so that the ocean currency, water flow will be changed, and they are much more rich sea ocean there, and we're going to get lots of fish from there. So after debris putting there and getting lots of fish. So that's just a little bit inspirational. So yeah, that's about it. I'm also net member, amateur radio emergency. I'm a little bit amateur geek around disaster. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. I love the concept of pre-disaster mitigation. I think that's what we're hearing a lot about tonight. And Claire mentioned that maybe we can look into success stories from around the world where people have actually taken steps to pre-address some of these issues so they don't become as bad of a disaster down the road. I'm going to turn it back over to Commissioner Myron and Commissioner Jayapal to close us out for the evening.
Thank you, John. And we are at 8:30, so not to keep you past, we are going to quickly shut down, but I want to say a tremendous thank you to everyone who has attended and given of your time tonight and asked really insightful questions and made some fantastic comments. You will receive an email with a link to the study and the recording of tonight. Also, we will follow up with everyone. If you have asked questions in the chat, we will follow up, and we are very available. If you have additional follow-up questions, we will get information to you. My dog, if you can hear my dog, is very enthusiastic about that. And in terms of engagement, I saw some some of this in the chat. We don't know how to reach out to absolutely everyone, and our intent is to be as inclusive as possible. And so if there are others or other ways of engaging or people, I'm so sorry if my dog is Penny, of engaging that you would recommend that we should do, or people you would like to put us in contact with, please reach out and let us know, because we want to be absolutely as inclusive as possible. So thank you all to everyone. And I see that notice about helpful to have more than one day's notice of meetings like this. Yeah, we try.
Thank you,
have a lovely evening. And Commissioner Jayapal?
Not a lot more to add to that. Just really, really want to appreciate you all being here, giving your time this evening. Appreciate the quality of the questions and the dedication. I mean, really, the work that a lot of you have done is what's led to this study. So want to appreciate that so much. And want to, I think there were some great questions asked and also some great suggestions about things to think about. And that was one of the main purposes of this session, was to elicit from you that, hey, have you thought about the houseboats? Have you thought about this region? Have you, so please do keep thinking about those sorts of additions to this analysis of what the consequences are going to be, because that's the concrete work that we're trying to do with the study, and you all are absolutely integral to it. So thank you all very much. Have a great night.